In the Middle Ages, some weapons weren't just feared on the battlefield. They were also targeted by official rules, church decrees, and city laws meant to control violence and keep the social order in place. The interesting part is that many of these banned weapons didn't disappear at all. Soldiers kept using them, towns kept seeing them, and commanders kept paying for them because they worked. In this video, we're going through 8 medieval weapons that were restricted on paper, but still showed up in real wars and real life. And for each one, we'll look at what the ban actually meant, who it was aimed at, and why people kept carrying it anyway. Number 1. The crossbow ban. The medieval crossbow looks straightforward, but it changed the balance of power in a way people noticed immediately. Instead of drawing a bowstring back with your arms every single shot, a crossbow lets you cock the string with a mechanical aid, lock it in place, and then aim while the stored energy just sits there. Early models could be spanned with a simple belt hook or a lever. Later ones needed a windlass or a geared crank because the bow itself became stronger, sometimes moving from wood to composite and even to steel. The ammunition was a short bolt, often called a quarrel, built to stay stiff and hit hard at shorter ranges. A crossbow usually fired more slowly than a bow, but each shot was consistent, and the weapon could stay loaded while the shooter waited behind cover. The payoff was control. A crossbowman could hold a shot at full power for longer than a bowman, which matters on walls, behind a shield, or in a packed siege line where you don't want to waste movement. That mix of power and accessibility is one reason the crossbow picked up a bad reputation among medieval elites. A well-trained knight invested years in riding, weapons, armor, and a war horse. A crossbow didn't erase that advantage, but it did threaten it, because a projectile doesn't care about someone's social rank. Even if armor could stop many hits, the fear was real. A weapon that could be learned faster could still defeat expensive protection under the right conditions. Crossbows also fit siege warfare perfectly, and sieges were the most common kind of big medieval fighting. If you're trying to defend a gatehouse or clear a wall walk, a compact point-and-shoot missile weapon is simply useful. So it's not surprising that one of the best-known medieval weapon bans comes from the church. In 1139, the Second Lateran Council issued a rule condemning the use of crossbowmen and archers against Christians. Instead of treating it as a normal crime, it framed it as a spiritual offense tied to punishment inside the church. In plain language, it was an attempt to control how Christians fought each other. The detail people often miss is that this wasn't a blanket ban on owning a crossbow. It was a ban on using these missile weapons in wars between Christians, while leaving room for use against non-Christians, which fit the crusading mindset of the time. Here's the catch. Medieval politics and medieval warfare didn't line up neatly with religious ideals. Christian rulers still fought each other constantly, and those wars still needed effective troops. City militias relied on crossbows because they were practical for defense. Lords hired professional crossbowmen because they were useful in sieges where accuracy and the ability to shoot from cover mattered. You even see specialized equipment built around them, like large shields, pavises, carried to protect shooters while they reloaded. Italian cities built serious crossbow traditions, and professional units carried the weapon across borders as paid soldiers. Once the crossbow had a place in military systems, the ban couldn't remove it. What it did do was label it as controversial and morally suspect in certain contexts, which tells you something important about the Middle Ages. A lot of bans were really arguments about what kind of violence was acceptable and who was allowed to use it. And if the church was worried about the crossbow, it wasn't only the crossbow. The same line of thinking hit ordinary archery too. Number 2. The war bow was condemned too. The pop culture version of the story is the Pope banned the crossbow. But the medieval wording also targeted archers. That matters because it shows the debate wasn't only about a clever mechanical bow. It was about ranged killing in general, especially when used inside Christian Europe. From the perspective of church reformers and some knightly writers, missile troops made warfare feel less controlled and less personal. They also made it harder to protect the social hierarchy of the battlefield, because a skilled archer, often a commoner, could influence outcomes that aristocrats liked to think depended on noble courage and elite training. At the same time, bows were too useful to be pushed out of real warfare. A war bow is not a toy. In Northern Europe, the longbow became famous because of English and Welsh practice, but powerful bows existed in many regions, and archers were standard in medieval armies. A bow is light. It doesn't need complex metal mechanisms, and it can put a lot of arrows downrange quickly. When commanders wanted to disrupt formations, threaten horses, and pressure an enemy before contact, archers were one of the best tools available. What makes this ban but still used story especially interesting is that some governments went in the opposite direction of the church and treated archery like national infrastructure. In England, royal orders and later statutes pushed regular practice because skilled archers don't appear overnight. Communities built practice butts. Local officials were told to make sure men trained on feast days and holidays, and some rules even discouraged unprofitable games because they distracted from shooting practice. So, you have condemnation in one direction and state pressure in the other because rulers cared more about battlefield results than about moral discomfort with missiles. And the battlefield results kept archery alive. In the 100 Years' War, massed archery shaped famous battles and forced armies to adapt their tactics. Armor improved, shields and formations adjusted, and commanders learned to use terrain and discipline to reduce arrow damage. But archery remained central because it worked at scale. So the religious condemnation didn't stop the war bow. It mostly shows you a moral reaction to a military reality. Once you move past the battlefield, you find a different kind of ban that mattered every day. Governments trying to keep order inside towns. That's where bans become less about fairness in war and more about don't bring weapons into crowded streets. And one of the first weapons that shows up in those rules is the spear and its mounted version, the lance. Number 3. The spear and lance controls. A spear is one of the most efficient weapons of the Middle Ages. It's cheap compared to a sword. It gives reach, and it works in formation. Put a spear in a mounted knight's hands, and you get the lance, which becomes a symbol of the armored cavalryman. A couched lance charge, supported by a solid saddle and stirrups, was as much a social display as it was a tactic. It said, "This is the fighting class." That symbolism mattered so much that rulers and lawmakers tried to keep spear and sword status out of the wrong hands, not because spears were inherently evil, but because weapons were tied to rank and political control. In the Holy Roman Empire, one approach to limiting private violence was the Landfrieden, or land peace, a set of rules meant to reduce feuding and armed disorder. In the mid-12th century, under King Frederick I, Barbarossa, a peace ordinance explicitly targeted peasants carrying the key weapons of armored riders. If a peasant was found with a spear or a sword, local officials were empowered to confiscate the weapons or enforce a heavy fine. The point wasn't that peasants never fought. The point was that carrying the symbols of knighthood in everyday life blurred social boundaries and made local violence harder to control. That theory ran into the same wall medieval law often hit. War needs bodies, and bodies need weapons. If you call up levies, the simplest way to arm them is pole weapons. Town militias were expected to have spears. Rural communities had staff weapons that could be pressed into service. And by the late Middle Ages, infantry tactics in many places leaned heavily on long pole arms, spears, pikes, bills, and related weapons, because disciplined foot soldiers could stop cavalry and dominate ground. So even when rulers tried to restrict spear-like weapons in peacetime, the spear family of weapons kept spreading because it was the most realistic way to arm large numbers of men. So you end up with a ban that says peasants shouldn't carry knightly weapons, while reality keeps putting spear-like weapons into common hands. The law is still real, but it functions as a boundary marker. It tells you what the ruling class wanted society to look like. The battlefield tells you what society had to do when danger showed up. The same pattern repeats with the most iconic medieval weapon of all. Swords were prestige objects and practical sidearms. So when authorities tried to control public violence, swords were one of their main targets. Number 4. The sword in public. Swords dominate medieval stories, but in actual combat, a sword was usually a sidearm, not the main tool. Spears, bows, polearms, and formations did the heavy work. Still, the sword carried huge cultural weight.
It signaled rank, freedom, and often membership in the fighting class. In a town environment, that also meant a sword was a public threat, especially when worn in groups or carried by strangers. A sword on a belt changes the mood of a street because it turns an argument into a serious risk in seconds. Because of that, many medieval sword bans are really public order restrictions, rules about who can carry a sword, where, and under what conditions. London is a good example because its civic records preserve detailed ordinances. You find rules aimed at keeping night peace, controlling outsiders, and limiting the kind of street violence that could spiral fast. Strangers, people outside the city's citizen body, could be ordered not to carry swords and other arms within the city at all. Other rules carved out exceptions for higher status, the kind of you can carry if you're important enough logic that shows up often in medieval law. Across England, you also see class-based restrictions tied to fears about mobile labor and unrest after the Black Death. In 1388, a statute linked to the Cambridge Parliament included a clause that prohibited servants in husbandry and laborers from wearing a sword in public, except in specific cases, such as accompanying their masters or traveling in time of war. This kind of wording tells you what lawmakers were worried about. Armed men moving around without supervision, mixing into markets and festivals, and being hard to identify if trouble started. Even with rules like that, swords remained part of daily life for many groups. Households kept armed men. Travelers carried weapons on roads that were not always safe. Soldiers returning from service didn't stop being soldiers. And enforcement was uneven because medieval policing was limited and selective. In practice, the ban often meant extra scrutiny for outsiders, for the lower classes, and for anyone carrying a weapon at the wrong time or place. That pressure produced a common workaround. People leaned toward lighter gear that was easier to justify and easier to carry. One of the most typical pairings in late medieval towns was a sword with a small shield called a buckler, and authorities didn't miss what that combination could do. Number 5. The buckler. A buckler is a small shield held with a central grip designed for speed. It doesn't cover the whole body like earlier battlefield shields. Instead, it helps in close fighting, where quick deflections, hand protection, and sudden openings matter. That makes it ideal for foot combat, and it also makes it ideal for the kind of violence city officials worried about: fast fights in narrow streets.
It's portable, it doesn't look like heavy armor, and it can turn an unarmored person into a much more capable fighter. In England, bucklers appear in weapon restrictions right alongside swords and daggers. A clause from the 1388 Cambridge Parliament era explicitly barred servants and laborers from wearing a sword, buckler, or dagger, except in limited situations. It's basically a description of a light street fighting kit, a sidearm, a small shield, and a backup blade. The same legal culture that could demand men be prepared for defense could also punish them for carrying the wrong gear in public, because the goal was control, not disarmament in the modern sense. Bucklers stayed in use anyway because they were practical. They were cheaper and easier to carry than a full shield, and they still mattered for soldiers who fought on foot. Late medieval fighting manuals include buckler play because it was a real skill set, not just a story detail. Even if city governments tried to discourage brawls or punish troublemakers, the object itself was too common and too useful to vanish. People could claim they carried it for travel, for militia duty, or for lawful protection, and those reasons weren't always easy to disprove.
Once you start noticing these rules, you also notice how often they focus on weapons that sit in a gray area. Items that are easier to carry daily than a full sword, but more aggressive than a simple tool. One of the biggest examples of that gray zone is the basilard. Number 6. The basilard. The basilard is often described as a long dagger, but many basilards function like short swords. They can have straight, double-edged blades and sturdy grips with wide guards that lock the hand in place. In the 14th and 15th centuries, basilards show up in art and inventories, and they also show up in legal records, which usually means one thing. Enough people carried them that authorities felt the need to regulate them. In some places, the basilard was even a fashionable item, worn as part of dress, which made it even harder to police consistently. The basilard's real problem, from a lawmaker's viewpoint, is that it sits between categories. If you call it a knife, it sounds like a tool. If you call it a sword, it sounds like a status weapon. In crowded medieval towns, that ambiguity made it easier to justify carrying one and easier to start trouble with one. That's why basilards appear in urban ordinances, especially in places like London, where civic government tried to draw clear lines. Some rules treated a basilard as the one blade a person might be allowed to carry in certain circumstances, while other blades were restricted, which is a very medieval solution. Don't ban everything, just try to control the most threatening combinations. On the continent, the same pattern shows up in different forms. Several German legal codes and town regulations treated the basilard, often spelled differently, as an illegal street weapon with fines or confiscation attached. The details vary by place, but the logic stays the same. When a weapon becomes common in urban violence, it becomes a legal target. And yet, the basilard stayed popular because it worked. For soldiers, it was a solid backup weapon that didn't depend on a big swing or a long reach.
For civilians, it was easier to wear daily than a full sword and could still handle basic cutting tasks. Also, bans often created their own trends. The moment an ordinance allows one specific blade by day, people who want to be armed choose the allowed blade. So regulation didn't erase the basilard. It helped define it as the standard acceptable weapon in the middle ground between sword and knife. That brings you to the broader issue medieval governments struggled with all the time: the dagger, the one weapon that was genuinely everywhere, because it could be both a tool and a threat. Number 7. The dagger. Daggers were part of daily life in medieval Europe for a simple reason. Small blades are useful. They cut food, rope, cloth, and leather, Soldiers used them constantly in camp. At the same time, a purpose-built dagger is easy to conceal, fast to draw, and dangerous at very close range. That combination made daggers a recurring focus in medieval laws about public order, especially in towns where conflicts could flare up in seconds and witnesses could be intimidated. Some legal systems tried to draw a sharp line between a general working knife and a dagger designed for harm. Medieval Norway is a clear case. The national law code known as the Laws of the Land treated daggers as a special category and made carrying a dagger punishable by a fine. Archaeology suggests daggers were still common, which points to the usual enforcement problem. It's hard to police an object that is small, widespread, and sometimes hard to define. A short blade for eating is normal. A narrow stabbing blade is suspicious, and between those two, there's a lot of overlap. In English towns, you see similar suspicion. London's rules about weapon carrying could get very specific about who was allowed what.
A servant might be allowed one kind of blade, but not another, and those distinctions are telling. They show that authorities weren't only worried about weapons in the abstract. They were worried about the kind of blade most associated with sudden assaults and secret carrying, especially when worn by someone with no clear ties to a household or guild. On the battlefield, daggers never went away. Medieval armored combat often turned into close clinches and grappling, where long weapons were awkward. A dagger was a last-ditch option, but it was also a normal tool of soldiering. And that practicality is exactly why dagger bans tend to appear in civic and peacetime contexts, rather than as battlefield rules. Even then, enforcement often depended on status. Someone in military service or under a lord's protection could claim a lawful reason, while a stranger with the same blade could be treated as a threat. Once you recognize that pattern, the last weapon makes sense. Some banned weapons weren't hidden at all. They were obvious, even ordinary, but officials still tried to restrict them when they feared disorder. The hand axe is a perfect example. Number 8. The hand axe. A hand axe sits right on the line between tool and weapon. Medieval Europe ran on wood, and woodwork needs axes. Building frames, repairing carts, cutting fuel, working on ships, clearing land. At the same time, a short haft with an iron head can deliver heavy blows in combat, damage shields, and threaten armored opponents by targeting joints and weaker points. Axes appear in the hands of infantry, in town militias, and even among higher status fighters, depending on region and fashion. In the late Middle Ages, more specialized versions like the poleaxe became a standard choice for armored foot fighting, while smaller hatchets stayed common with ordinary infantry. Because axes were common tools, banning them sounds unrealistic, and that's exactly why medieval restrictions often focused on context and on outsiders. London records include ordinances that told strangers not to carry a hutch, a hand axe, within the city, listing it alongside swords, basilards, and daggers. The goal was straightforward: keep armed outsiders from turning crowded streets into a danger zone. An axe is hard to hide, but it's also hard to ignore, and if someone is carrying one without an obvious work reason, it signals trouble before anything even happens. But the same practical problem returns. Towns needed axes for work, and armies needed them for war. So enforcement had to rely on judgment: who is carrying it, where, and why. And medieval officials didn't always have the manpower to apply those rules consistently. That gap between law and daily life is exactly why a weapon can be banned on paper and still show up in inventories, city streets, and battlefields for centuries.